If you have ever watched a game of competitive Gen 2, or you even have just the most basic idea of the generation, one thing you have probably noticed is the bizarre state of held items in this generation. Generation 2 was the first gen to introduce held items, but there's only a single item that ever seems to be used. That item is leftovers. Leftovers is by far the best item in competitive Gen 2. No other item even comes close. Leftovers is in fact so good that it's the item of choice on almost every single Pokemon in every single metagame. Except Little Quiltbutt. The Pokemon who use leftovers range from defensive titans such as Blissey, Snorlax, and Lugia to frail offensive Pokemon such as Alakazam, Gengar, and Dugtrio. You cannot escape leftovers. But why? Why is this the case? Why is leftovers the item of choice on over 95% of the Pokemon? Are there any Pokemon who don't use leftovers? I will explain all of this and more. When you understand leftovers, you actually understand more than the item itself. Leftovers can help give us an insight into how competitive Gen 2 is played. Leftovers helps you understand some of the other biggest components of competitive Gen 2, such as spikes and the maxed out EVs. The item ties into those big aspects. I'd say there are two main reasons why leftovers is so common. Firstly, leftovers are needed in the landscape GSC has given us. Leftovers is a simple item. At the end of a turn, a Pokemon holding leftovers recovers 1/16 of their maximum HP. The Pokemon recovers 6.25% out of 100%. Already, this is a supremely useful effect. Leftovers does wonders for a Pokemon's longevity and hit taking. It lets you passively heal your HP over a long period. It makes it easier for you to stick around, survive, and switch in. 6.25% may not sound like much, but it adds up over time. Keep switching leftovers holding Pokemon in over time, and witness the total percent recovered per battle. Pokemon is a game where the smallest percents can have large impacts. 6.25% or less can often be the difference between a win and a loss. The HP recovered from leftovers could let a Pokemon survive an attack it would have been KO'd by otherwise, had it not been for the passive recovery of leftovers. If you double switch a leftovers holding Pokemon in, you get free HP if spikes aren't up, and then you can just switch out if you want. Leftovers as an item will likely always have a place in competitive Pokemon. Passively healing 6.25% of your Pokemon's HP at the end of every turn is just very valuable, especially for defensive Pokemon. In the context of GSC though, leftovers is far more than valuable. To explain why, we first need to look at the biggest difference between competitive Gen 2 and every other generation after. The biggest difference between Gen 2 and its successors is the implementation of effort values, or EVs. To keep it brief, EVs are values that determine how a Pokemon's stats evolve. You can alter which stats, such as HP or attack, a Pokemon can gain EVs in by defeating certain Pokemon or by giving them certain vitamin items, such as protein, carbos, or zinc. The EV cap for one stat is 252. This is where the difference comes in. In competitive Gen 3 and beyond, you have 508 maximum EV points to give out across all stats. At most, you can only have the maximum EVs in 2 stats. In Gen 2, there is no 508 cap. Every Pokemon is free to use 252 EVs in all 6 of their stats. The impact this has on the game is profound. If you have ever wondered why Pokemon seem so much naturally bulkier in Gens 1 and 2 compared to later generations, this is why. It's why you rarely see Pokemon straight up one-hit KO'd. In a landscape where everything is much naturally bulkier, Leftovers is even more powerful. It goes beyond Leftovers just being a good item though. It can be argued that Leftovers is the glue of competitive GSC, the thing that holds everything together. If it wasn't for Leftovers, competitive Gen 2 would be significantly less viable as a competitive avenue. In competitive Pokemon, most Pokemon can serve as a check or counter to something. Let's look at an OU example. Roar Golem against a Cursed Snorlax whose only offensive move is Double Edge. In a vacuum, yes, Golem can serve as an answer to Cursed Snorlax. However, it is going to be worn down over time. Snorlax is going to keep attacking it with Double Edge, possibly boosted by Curse, as Golem switches in or as Golem uses Roar. This is far worse if Spikes are up. Golem takes 12.5% every time it switches in. In all likelihood, it won't be a good Snorlax answer for long. If Golem has Leftovers though, it is much better at handling Snorlax. It can passively heal against Snorlax and any other threat, especially if Spikes are off. It can actually serve as a long-term answer. This example occurs with so many other Pokemon. Pokemon such as Zapdos and Nidoking are incredibly powerful when Spikes are up, and their checks are unable to passively heal. Defensive play is far harder to achieve without Leftovers. Spikes are incredibly suffocating. If GSC OU didn't have Leftovers, defensive play and longevity would take a significant hit, and Pokemon such as Zapdos, Snorlax, Gengar, and Nidoking would be very suffocating, probably ban-worthy. Spikes would be overpowered if you couldn't stave them off with Leftovers. Leftovers help keep things in check. They allow Pokemon to have longevity against the Pokemon they are designed to be. You could use moves such as Recover or Rest, but even Pokemon with these moves are worse hit takers without Leftovers. This isn't just the case in OU. Everything I described about longevity, checks and counters, and spikes also applies to Ubers, UU, NU, and PU. It isn't just defensive teams or Pokemon that suffer without Leftovers. Offensive Pokemon still heavily rely on Leftovers. Offensive teams still pack tanky Pokemon such as Snorlax in OU who rely heavily on Leftovers. To summarize, Leftovers make defensive play viable and they give Pokemon longevity. They stop Spikes from breaking the game and they allow Pokemon to serve as long-term checks to their fellow Pocket Monsters. This is why almost every single Pokemon uses Leftovers. Having that longevity, that ability to switch in and recover some HP, far outweighs the benefits of every other item. Most of the time. Every bit of damage sticks when you don't have Leftovers. In GSC, everything is so naturally bulky. That is going to make games take a while. In longer games, longevity is everything. Even with offensive teams, you still need to be able to answer things defensively. When you use an offensive team in OU, Zapdos is going to find opportunities to switch in, and you need Leftovers on Snorlax to answer it as best as you can. Use a team without Leftovers and watch how easily an opposing team with 6 Leftovers holding Pokemon outlasts you and wears you down. You just can't keep up. Longevity and defensive utility are at the heart of GSC. If you play all recklessly with your Pokemon, you let them take crucial bits of damage or status, you're going to lose very quickly. You could be a super destructive Pokemon, but if you have poor longevity and little defensive utility, you aren't going to break the game. So many Pokemon rely on Leftovers to stay afloat in longer games. Some Pokemon are able to justify not using recovery moves. They are able to get away with just leftovers recovery. To illustrate how important leftovers are, let's examine a Pokemon who can't use leftovers and see how that affects its viability. Let's look at OU Marowak. Marowak is a very destructive Pokemon. After using Sword Stance, it can one-hit KO almost every Pokemon. However, Marowak must hold Thick Club to achieve that power. The inability to hold Leftover severely hinders Marowak's viability. When Marowak switches in with Spikes up, it loses 12.5% of its HP, and it can't heal that off. Every bit of damage sticks to Marowak, no matter how weak it is. Marowak has an electric immunity and decent physical defense, but it can't check anything long term because it can't passively heal. Yeah, you could switch it into a Tyranitar Rock Slide once, but the damage from that sticks, especially badly if Spikes are up. Marowak more often than not requires Rapid Spin to help its massive Spikes problem, and even then, it's a Pokemon that requires a lot of care, and contributes little to its team defensively. If Marowak could somehow hold both Thick Club and Leftovers, it would certainly be a more popular OU Pokemon. The longevity of Leftovers is necessary in the slower paced, more methodical nature of competitive Gen 2. The item is fundamentally very good, and in a landscape like GSC's, it thrives even more. In fact, Leftovers is kind of too powerful. It is supremely difficult to break certain Pokemon, certain cores of Pokemon, when they are so naturally bulky and have Leftovers passively healing them. It is very difficult to make damage stick against something holding Leftovers, because the opponent can just switch out and recover the damage off via double switches. Leftovers is, however, balanced out by Spikes. Spikes and Leftovers help balance each other out. Spikes stop Leftovers from just absorbing all damage and they help make damage stick. Leftovers, meanwhile, stop Spikes from being too powerful. Spikes help make damage actually stick against Leftovers, and they help neuter Leftovers recovery. Spikes stop you from just endlessly switching around defensive Leftovers holding Pokemon. The main reason Spikes are so necessary in GSCOU and GSC Ubers is the fact that they fight off Leftovers, an otherwise broken item. In UU and below, where it's harder to just soak up all damage with Leftovers because Pokemon are naturally frailer, Spikes aren't as required, though they still dominate the metagames. So that is the first main reason Leftovers are so omnipresent in GSC. They are a fundamentally powerful item that adds so much more depth to the game. They give Pokemon longevity, and they make defensive play possible. In a generation as bulky as GSC, Leftovers is everything, because longevity is also everything. Now, it's time for the other reason why Leftovers is so good. The other reason why Leftovers is so omnipresent is that there's just no competition for the item slot. GSC, as the generation to introduce held items, naturally has the smallest pool of items. Of the items in the game, there's just no competition. Leftovers is far and away the best item for over 95% of the Pokemon in the game. Most of the items that have defined competitive Pokemon history, such as the choice items, Life Orb, Air Balloon, and so on, don't exist in GSC. In GSC, the list of items is basically limited to the type boosting items, berries, Pokemon specific items, and high risk items. The type boosting items, such as Mystic Water, Charcoal, Magnet, and so on, only give you a small boost, a boost that rarely comes in handy. The only berries that can be useful are Miracle Berry and very rarely Mint Berry in the lower tiers. The Pokemon specific items only work on the Pokemon they are designed for, and not all of them are useful. Nobody is using Lucky Punch on Chansey. Finally, the high risk items are just that, high risk. Items such as Berserk Gene, Quick Claw, and Bright Powder could do some funky stuff, but they aren't consistently reliable. Ultimately, the biggest problem facing all of these items is the fact that they must replace leftovers. You must sacrifice the longevity, the consistently useful recovery provided by leftovers, in favour of these very situationally useful items. Why would you use Twisted Spoon on Alakazam? With leftovers and recover, Alakazam can be a decent switch into some Pokemon. Drop leftovers, and Alakazam has to spend more turns using recover. It's even harder for this frail Pokemon to function effectively. Alakazam must sacrifice leftovers for a small boost to the power of its Psychic. Even with this boost, it still loses to Pokemon like Snorlax. There do exist Pokemon in competitive GSC that don't use leftovers. However, these Pokemon have specific assets or playstyles that help justify it. Some Pokemon can use the type boosting items. The most famous one is Moltres in OU. Moltres is a naturally bulky Pokemon who, importantly, is immune to spikes. This does make it easier for it to justify dropping leftovers. Charcoal does come in handy. Moltres has a 92% chance to 2-hit KO Snorlax with Fire Blast if the sun is up, but only if it's holding Charcoal. If it's not holding Charcoal, it only has a 10% chance to do so. Charcoal isn't required on Moltres. It can use leftovers to have a better matchup against Nidoking and the like, but it uses Charcoal fairly often. Miracle Berry is probably both the second best and most common item behind leftovers. Miracle Berry is just GSC's version of Lumberry. You have the ability to shrug off any bit of status one time, even confusion. Some Pokemon make good use of Miracle Berry. Smeargle in OU exclusively uses the item. Smeargle is so frail that leftovers is kinda pointless on it. It much prefers to dodge status using Miracle Berry. Certain setup sweepers, such as UU Scyther or OU Charizard, can use Miracle Berry to have an easier time setting up. They don't have to be deathly afraid of paralysis or sleep. Scyther and Charizard have an easier time justifying Miracle Berry because they are Spikes immune. Certain offensive Pokemon on offensive teams use Miracle Berry since it lets them play more aggressively. It lets them ignore paralysis, and they don't need leftovers as much, due to their aggressive nature. Examples of this would include Uber's Mewtwo and Lead Mew, Cloyster in OU and Ubers, and Electrode in UU. The other most popular item choice outside of leftovers is no item. Holding no item lets you steal the opponent's leftovers using the move Thief. I already went over how much generally worse Pokemon are without leftovers, and Thief gets them to that state. Stealing the leftovers of a big defensive piece can be game changing. Thief is a fairly widely used move in GSC, being used by several Pokemon in several tiers. This speaks volumes as to how powerful and omnipresent leftovers is. So yeah, GSC lacks a lot of the competitive Pokemon defining items. To be honest though, even if GSC had choice items, Life Orb and so on, I don't think they would be used that much. Sacrificing that longevity is something you need a seriously good reason to do. Leftovers would still be easily both the best and most common item. They are just far too important for the GSC landscape. That is the conclusion of this analysis. Leftovers is a glue that holds competitive Gen 2 together. Leftovers is omnipresent because it is powerful, has little competition, and most of all, is needed. When you go out there and play competitive Gen 2, which I encourage you to do, you will encounter leftovers in every game that you play. If you want to see a game where leftovers does some work, watch the 2 most recent videos that I made. They are battle videos where leftovers is very prominent. I also have another battle video coming out soon that also features leftovers. I'll see you all in that video. Thanks for watching.